Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know folks are still joining here. My name is Helena Bottomiller-Evich. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Food Fix, a newsletter about food policy. I've covered food and ag policy for a long time, nearly 15 years. Before I launched Food Fix, I was at Politico for nearly a decade covering food policy there. And I left a big newsroom to launch my own publication, which focuses on these issues. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about how simple food swaps fight climate change. That's our topic for today. I think it's a really interesting issue to dive into. I know a lot of consumers are seeing climate claims and labels. I hear a lot from my readers about this. There's a lot of concern about climate change. There's a lot of questions about what individuals should or can do. There's also a lot of confusion, right? There's a lot of greenwashing. There's just a lot of claims, and I think it's hard to navigate. And so we're going to dive into all of this. We're going to look at how a couple of companies are kind of leaning into this and trying to navigate things like, carbon neutrality and making different swaps and trying to reduce their emissions across the menu. We have a really great panel today. We have Jim Jarman, the VP of Product and Marketing at Neutral Foods. We have Corey Blumenthal, a sustainability specialist, or maybe the sustainability specialist at Shake Shack. And we have Emmy award-winning journalist Mohammed Leela, who is the founder and CEO of Goodable, a good news platform that has a really interesting model we're going to hear more about. So to get us started, I thought I would have each of you just say just a couple of words about what you do, what you're working on, and kind of get us oriented here. And we are going to start things off with Jim. So go ahead.
All right. Well, I'm Jim Jarman, as Helena said. I grew up on a farm, but basically never really wanted or intended to make a career out of something in the food world. That said, I've spent the last 2 decades leading businesses primarily in the food and beverage sector with places like Organic Valley, Cargill, now Neutral, Land O'Lakes. And here at Neutral, our role really is as the first carbon neutral food company in the US. And we're on a mission to radically reduce the emissions of animal agriculture for good. We do that by providing 100% carbon neutral food staples and are helping to accelerate the transition to climate smart ag practices.
All right, Corey, we're going to go to you next.
Yes, perfect. Hi, everybody. I'm Corey Blumenthal, and I'm the sustainability specialist at Shake Shack. I have a background in sustainability. I got my master's in energy and sustainability. And as part of my role, I collaborate across our entire organization to help ideate and implement sustainability initiatives. And these initiatives are designed to help us reduce our environmental impact while preserving the quality and taste of the menu items our guests love, such as our iconic shake, which I'm excited to share, is now available at specific locations with neutral milk.
All right, Mohammed, your turn.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me here. My name is Mohammed Leela, as you mentioned. I'm the founder and CEO of Goodable. I'm actually like a war zone correspondent for most of my career. I've led more deployments to war zones than I can even remember. Been shot at, held at gunpoint, survived explosions, all that crazy fun stuff. One day I woke up and I realized that I was the person on television that was telling people how bad the world is. And that had become my life. And I said, I don't want this to become my life. I'd rather be the person that tells people how good things are happening in the world. And so we launched Goodable. We now generate something like 100 million impressions per month, which is exciting for us because we've grown so big. And we're doing it by only covering good things happening in the world, which I think the world needs now more than ever. Thank you.
Fascinating. Yeah, I cannot wait to learn more about that. As someone in the news business, it is certainly an anxiety-inducing career. And I think there's a lot of research. The more media we consume, the more anxious we all are. So I want to get right into, but I mentioned at the top that I get a lot of questions from my newsletter readers. Food Fix is a great newsletter. I'm sure you're all already reading it. But I get a lot of questions about what to make of climate claims, right? We are now seeing climate smart cereal. We're seeing carbon positive dairy. We're seeing regenerative, climate smart regenerative, organic regenerative, regenerative organic. And there's a lot happening, right? And I think that consumers are really confused, like what's greenwashing and what's real. So I just want to start off with that tension. Like how are each of you focused on making sure the work you're doing has a measurable impact, that you're actually reducing emissions, and that you're not greenwashing. And I don't know if maybe Corey, want to start with you, because I know you're really interfacing with consumers. So
No, totally. So I know the term greenwashing is really common, but I think it's important to know that it's on a spectrum. And on one end, we have greenwashing, and on the other end, there's a less common term, but green hushing. And this happens when organizations deliberately choose to underreport or hide what they're doing in the ESG space to avoid any scrutiny. So I think it's critical for organizations like Shake Shack to avoid either end of the spectrum. So greenwashing, green hushing, by publicly sharing their sustainability initiatives and the progress that they're making against them. As this can have a cascading effect. I think when a well-known and respected organization begins to publicly prioritize sustainability, it can then put pressure on corporate competitors or others in the space, as well as their suppliers, to begin to prioritize it as well. And this is what we're doing at Shake Shack, particularly with our Stand for Something Good report, which we release annually. We acknowledge both our successes, so what we're doing well, what we've achieved in the past year, but also where we fell short. And I think that's really great, because sustainability is about progress, not perfection.
yeah, Jim, I want to kick it to you, because certainly when people see a label of something being carbon neutral, they're like, is it really though? I mean, how are you navigating this? I'm sure this is one of the number one things you are asked about, whether you're meeting with a farmer or a consumer who's just confused AF right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that concerns me most, and it's a real reason for consumers to have questions, is we hear a lot of things. Like in the dairy industry in particular, where we spend a lot of time, the industry has made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050.
Yeah,
And that's great, but it's not enough. It's not remotely enough. I mean, 27 years from now, let's be honest, not a single person that works at any of those companies is going to be there to be accountable for that 27 years from now. So we need to make concrete steps now. And to Corey's point, it's about progress. So we really kind of have a philosophy around radical transparency. Let's be as clear about what we're doing, make it as accessible as possible so that people can start to trust that. And they don't just have to trust us. Every single thing that we do from a carbon perspective gets audited and verified by third parties who can independently look at this and see, is it right? That's one of the reasons that we choose some of the tougher standards to certify against in terms of that carbon neutrality claim, to make sure that consumers can know there's a hard standard against this. It is measured, it is verified, and somebody outside of our walls is making sure that that's all true. We want to make sure people have trust in that system. If they don't, it'll be really easy to check out. I mean, it's already a tough enough challenge, right? We see this big giant mountain that we're all trying to climb, and it can be discouraging if you let it. But when you can see every day that there's an actual ability to make progress with something as simple as like choosing the yellow carton from the shelf instead of the red one, that you can make that difference, and we want to make it visible for the consumers. That's actually one of the things that it was great. Muhammad was recently out at one of the farms we're working with, and one of the reasons that we want people to come out and see that is so they have a chance to see with their own eyes. This is what's going on. This is what's happening with these farmers. This is how we're making a difference every single day.
Yeah, and I want to move on to Mohammed just in a second, but real quick, for those who aren't familiar, how, maybe just in a nutshell, because I know we're going to get into it more later, but how is neutral achieving neutrality? I know there's a initial focus on offsets, and then the kind of goal is to move more because you're like investing in practices. But can you just talk a little bit about that? Because offsets have also, there's varying quality to that. There's a lot of questions about the long-term kind of validity. There's just, there's a lot of questions about how all it's going to work long-term. So can you maybe just get into that before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think offsets, it's important to talk about this because they were a critical feature for us. I mean, especially as we started, it was impossible to do the projects on farm before we had a product. And so we had to initially get started with the use of offsets. Now, I think they're better and worse versions of those. We use CARB certified offsets to be very, very transparent. We know that they come from the dairy industry, so it's coming right out of our same space. But what we do with farmers, there's basically 3 areas that you can have a huge impact. It's really around like what the cows are eating and sort of the enteric methane that's getting produced. It's about the manure management that's on site, and it's about Sorry, it's what they're eating, the enteric, it's the
You've
mirror
been up
management.
since 3 a.m. It's okay. You can take a
Yeah,
beat.
no,
Yeah.
that's okay. So basically there's three big areas. So what we do is we work with farmers, we bring them resources, we bring the money, we bring the technical resources, we bring the measurement and verification resources to help them implement that. I mean, farmers are some of the original stewards of the land, and they want to do these things right. But sometimes it's a lack of information. Like maybe I didn't even know that had a big climate impact. How do I do something different here? And if you can help me with the resources and all those technical things that will help me be more successful, they're willing to make those adopted practices. So we invest heavily. We have over 35 projects that are already going on right now, and that is accelerating super fast. And we are in a position now where we'll reduce over 60% of the emissions from our own product. We'll reduce in the supply chain project we're making this year. And that's leaps and bounds ahead of where anywhere else is at on this. And that's because for us, we started with the philosophy that we're going to be carbon neutral from day one. We're not going to get there 50 years from now. We're going to get there to start.
So just to clarify at that point, you're saying you have been able to reduce emissions from dairy production in your supply chain 60%?
Yeah, so if we look at the 100% total that we need to cancel out in order to make our product carbon neutral, we're able to achieve 60% or more of that this year from the projects that we're already putting in place.
I see. And then the remainder is sort of being filled by offsets. Okay.
That's correct. And we're accelerating like crazy. So those projects are going as fast as we can get them going.
Interesting. So Mohammed, my understanding, you've been to some of these recently. I don't know if you've already put out I'm going to watch some of your content. I love the idea of some good news.
It's rolling out now, but let me just start off by saying I have never had more fun being ankle deep in cow poo than I have being on these farms.
See, this is actually where I am happiest. I love going to farms, but I'm glad you had a good experience.
I've hung out with wildlife and farms and animals, but I've actually never been that close with like dairy cows and dairy cattle, and they're extremely docile, friendly. They're like the exact opposite of like menacing moose like we have here in Canada, right? They will run you over. They won't stop. These cows are actually nice. They'll let you cross the road. Like they're very friendly. Jake, who we were on the farm with, actually refers to some of them by name, which is like the cutest thing in the world to refer to cows by name. But there's a couple of principles here that I think are really important. Number one is something we've learned through this partnership is that climate change can be contentious in certain places. Certainly in America, it can be contentious. Now, the interesting thing is there's nobody who says we don't want a clean planet, clean water, clean processes for making food. Everybody sort of agrees. Where the disagreement comes in is like, well, what's the right way to achieve that? And is current policy making in line with like what's going to achieve that? Or is it like benefiting some people versus another? When you sort of filter out and you say, okay, well, what's the right way here to gain consumer confidence? Because at the end of the day, that's sort of like a business outcome that you're driving, but it's also kind of like a sustainability outcome that you want, right? Because what good is transforming a process from legacy into something new that's making the world better if you can't gain the consumer confidence? And so it goes back to a basic storytelling principle, which any journalist will tell you, especially if they worked in television, which is don't tell me, show me, right? So don't just sit around and say, well, this is what they do. No, like go and show people what you do. And this is the easiest way to generate consumer confidence. So for example, you'll meet people who are, for example, like when Jim says this claim about 60%, there'll automatically be people that'll have a visceral reaction and say, how's that even possible? Well, the answer is you hold them by their hand and you say, okay, well, let me show you how this is possible. Like I literally stood, and Jim knows this, I think he was there right next to me. I'd be standing in the feeding area where the cattle are, and you think there are hundreds and thousands of cattle, they're all feeding at the same time. And there's actually a manure management process that was implemented, which is kind of like a simple thing if you think about it, right? It's like, let's manage this in a way that it doesn't cause further emissions than it needs to. And in fact, like I don't know enough about the science behind this, Jim, you do. But when you sit there and you look at these processes in place, whether it's something like, the type of feed that the cattle are eating, or things that can be added, like additives to the feed, or even the manure management process, you're like, you know what, like, why hasn't somebody thought of this before? It's like you sit back and you're like, these things are working, they're practical, they're not extremely difficult to implement. It's not like you're asking somebody to redesign their entire supply chain or their farming process. It's like, no, you add this, you move this, you implement this, and it moves things around like in a really simple way. So I think, for us, the exciting part about this is we don't have to worry about the politics as much. We just have to show people, right? Like that's sort of our role in this process is let's just show people the companies out there that are making a difference, and going down to the farm really emphasized for us, like, um, it's happening, right? It's real. And I think this is important because there are a lot of people who are just like, oh, they can't be real, or maybe they're, it's just some crazy idea to make some crazy money. But no, like I can tell you 100%, like it's real. Like we've seen it with our own eyes.
Yeah, and I mean, you asked the question about why aren't more farmers doing it that way, and it's usually a combination of like money and incentives, right? There haven't really been incentives to move towards certain practices, right? Like changing feed ingredients, feed additives, things like that. Those are considered costs, and like who's going to pay for that. And I want to get into that. But one thing I wanted to follow up on, I know, like, you've had a long journalistic career. I'm curious how you think about who you'll work with on stories to avoid like perpetuating greenwashing. Like, how do you evaluate, like, okay, this is a real thing, I will happily highlight it, and this is like, no, this is just kind of marketing? And
Yeah,
I'm just curious if you could comment on that, because your model is kind of interesting.
yeah, the answer is we just do journalism. Like we do what we're supposed to do, and we investigate.
Ask questions. Yeah.
It's funny because we investigate corruption, right? And like all journalists do, and you're supposed to expose the politicians and expose the billionaires and like all that stuff. But we actually don't take that spotlight and shine it enough on people that are changing the world and that are doing things better. And so, we looked at, in so many industries, there's like a licensing or a certification process. With farming, it's complicated because it's difficult to understand sometimes, and there's a lot of different certification bodies. And for example, like fair trade coffee, there's a certification process. For certain organic products, there's a certification process. Well, we sat back and we said, well, journalists kind of, in a way, function like their own certification process, where they can actually investigate and say, yes, we've looked into this company. It passes our test. It passes the checks and balances that are in place, so that we can say, yes, they actually do what they deliver. They actually deliver what they say. And so with neutral, it was a very different calculation with neutral compared to like what it would be with an oil company or a mining company. As we all know, mining companies and oil companies have a lot of money, and they spend a lot of that money to look good. The challenge with that is like, okay, well, you built a school, but you also like decimated the village's water supply for the next 100 years because of your mining practices. So with neutral, we just applied those basic journalistic principles, which is like, okay, here's what they say they do. Are they doing it? Are they reputable? Are they credible? And then, quite honestly, being out on the farms was like the seal of approval for us, because there's no further test, that there's no further proof that you would need other than seeing something with your own eyes.
Yeah, it's such an interesting concept too, because we have this saying in journalism, like, there'll never be a story written about the plane that landed safely, right? It will be the plane that crashed, or the plane that like almost went off the runway, or like landed in the Hudson. Those are the ones that are covered. And you understand why, like, it's not newsworthy that the plane landed. But it is just an interest. It is absolutely true that there is a framing and bias towards negative news, because that's like corruption, tragedies. Those are the things we're going to focus on. So it is interesting. I think the other point, just to follow up on what you just said, one of the things that I think is challenging when we're in this space of corporate commitments, which are a large part of our US climate policy, for better or for worse, right? Like, there's a lot of criticism of that, but that's sort of the political reality that we're in, is that a lot of it rests on corporate commitments, voluntary country commitments to cut emissions. There isn't a lot of that follow-up from journalists going, who's sticking to this? What's real? Like, it's a real challenge, I think, to devote resources to that.
Helena, let me jump in and say, I think Jim knows this, having grown up on farms, but farmers are like the unsung heroes of America. They really, really are. I mean, people have these ideas of like farmers, maybe they're not educated, or they're just rural, or they're like a certain way, but like, the ones that we spoke to, incredibly articulate, highly educated, 100% committed. You can't be a farmer and be like 50% committed to what you're doing. It just doesn't work. It's all or nothing. And there are what, if not tens of thousands of farmers across America, if not even more. And the challenge that they face is they're getting hit from all sides, right? They're getting hit because people have decided to, in some places, to make farming political. And like, trust me, when you talk to the farmers, they don't want to become political things, right? They just want to farm and feed people and feed their communities and feed their states and their countries. And so they're getting hit from all sides. They're getting hit like on the policy side, on the political side. Then they're getting hit from like, everything is more expensive now. It's just a reality of the world that we live in, right? And who do you blame? Well, let's blame the people that are producing it. And so they're getting hit there. They're getting hit from different types of food movements, right? Vegan movements or non-meat movements or only organic movements. Like, they're getting hit from all sides. And it's really interesting because when you're getting hit from all sides, what do you do? Right. And this is the one sort of thing that I found really interesting with Neutral, because Neutral sort of comes in and says, well, hey, we've got this thing, it's not going to cost you more money. Like, we can just implement these things on your farm. It'll actually increase your output. I can't comment on the taste because I haven't drank the milk. I'm lactose intolerant, so I can't. But
I can. It's great.
So that's what I think, right? It's like, at the end of the day, it feels like if everything works the way that it's supposed to, it's just a win, 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 win at every stage of the process. And that's incredibly rare to have something where like everybody in a process wins. Because when you think about corporate sustainability, it's always a question of like, who manages the cost and who manages the burden, right? Is it the suppliers, the manufacturer? Like, what stage is that? Well, it seems like this is one of those rare cases where like everybody wins, which I think is great.
The
I
other
actually
thing
have
about
something that might kind of add on to what you were saying, but here at Shake Shack, switching to neutral milk was a win-win for us too, because operationally, we didn't have to change the build of our milkshake. What consumers actually get when, given their milkshake is the same as it was with the milk we were using before. We're not compromising on the taste or the quality. So really, it was a win-win for us also, and kind of like a seamless transition. And I think that businesses really need to look at where they can make these small tweaks that, yes, it's a small tweak, but it's going to have a big impact. By switching X amount of shakes every year to carbon neutral milk, we could really, reduce the amount of emissions that we have at Shake Shack. And I think what you were saying, how, it's a win-win on all fronts, is really kind of what we've seen from our partnership with Neutral.
And will you explain really quickly how many, like where this has been rolled out? And then did it cost more? Like, did you have to raise the cost of the milkshake? Are you going to market it? Can you explain just a little bit about how that would work? Because this is kind of a new idea. Like, I have not personally seen carbon neutrality advertised on a restaurant menu yet. I'm sure it is coming soon, but like, can you just explain how that works to folks?
Yeah. And I think I can give a bit of background as like how it came about, but ultimately Shake Shack, we sell a lot of shakes, as you can probably guess, it's in the name. So when we were looking at where we could, make the biggest impact without completely changing our business model.
And you mean in terms of emissions?
In terms of emissions, correct. We were automatically thinking, okay, meat and dairy. So could we find a supplier who, is better for the environment, but doesn't compromise on the quality and taste that, we're known and loved for? So when we found Neutral, it was such a fit. They obviously are prioritizing sustainability. It wouldn't change the actual milkshake that we are giving to guests. So we moved forward with a partnership. We started in the Pacific Northwest at all Shack locations there, and have slowly been transitioning to the East Coast region. So there are select states that have it, and hopefully, we'll have it in New York coming soon, which will be great. I think that what's important for us is that, we are always trying to find sustainable alternatives to ingredients that we have on our menu. And this was just an example of one of them that we were able to execute pretty seamlessly.
And do you internally have to like convince the executives that there's going to be some sort of ROI, or like because I imagine the ingredient does cost more. How do you think about that in terms of like emissions versus cost? Because this seems to be where a lot of folks get hung up, like on anything. It's like, if it costs more, like that is a trade-off. Like, how did you think about that part?
So ultimately, Shake Shack's mission is to stand for something good. And I think, that really we're embodying that when we're making these decisions, when we're picking supplier partners that have similar values and that are moving the needle on sustainability, which I think is kind of how we approached this situation. I also think, we really, the quality aspect is really important to us. We wouldn't just make a switch if it decreased the quality of the item. I think that also, though, we're seeing customers want sustainability. So that's a really big motivator for us. Internally, employees want to see us moving toward more sustainable alternatives. So I don't think there was much convincing, since it is just something, we are trying to incorporate sustainability everywhere we can. And so this was just one of the areas we were able to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jim, I want to go back to you. We've talked in the past a little bit about some of the technologies or different practices you can use on farm to reduce emissions. I don't know if you want to tell the watchers, the audience, a little bit more about those. I don't know that everyone spends their time thinking about agricultural science, even though it's the coolest ever. So important, but maybe not top of mind for everyone. Maybe start with feed additives. What can be done? I know this is one thing that always comes up in food and ag world. We can just do feed additives and maybe it's seaweed or whatever, and we can reduce emissions. And yet we're not scaling these practices up. I assume a lot of it comes down to cost. Can you just walk through some of the things you're doing, what's promising, and then maybe really quickly what the barriers are? And then before I forget, audience, we're going to take questions. So submit your questions, and we're going to have some time for that as well. Anyway, go ahead.
Sure thing. So feed additives is a great topic to tackle. I mean, it's a third of the emissions essentially is coming from the enteric methane that the cows are producing when they take something that we can't process, right? The grass that's in the background picture here, they take that stuff and turn it into something that's delicious, healthy, nutritious, that our bodies can't do that. We can't eat grass and have it do anything for us. So that ruminant activity, the way the cow processes that grass is actually where the emissions come from. So, with feed additives, you mentioned seaweed. So there's a red seaweed called Asparagopsis taxiformis that is being scaled up right now. We're working on some tests with that. Some other folks are doing something really similar. And that has, at least in early tests, has shown the ability to have impact of up to 80 to 90% reduction in emission that's coming when you're ingesting a very, very small amount of that Asparagopsis taxiformis in the feed source for the cows.
And with no reduction in, do you see any reduction in the efficiency at all? Sorry to interrupt.
I think that the research is still going on, but we haven't seen, I'm not aware that there's a reduction in efficiency for the animals there. Something that we're doing a lot more right now, because it's already approved, because right now Asparagopsis taxiformis is only really allowed to be used in a couple of states. It's not approved for use everywhere, but by 2024 it should be. But there are other things, something that we have a program for an additive, an essential oil called agalin, and it's coming from wild carrots, and coriander has a very strong smell. It when you walk in, even though it's going in a teaspoon per serving of the feed the cows.
Wait, so it all smells like coriander?
No, it does have a small smell, but the essential oil is coming from wild carrots and coriander. And this feed additive, essentially what it does is it takes the methanogen, that's the microbe, the microbes that are living in the cow's stomach, and it basically turns that feed source, and it turns it into emissions. It turns into methane that the cow is belching out. And that's not good for anyone. I mean, the cow doesn't like that because the burps are coming. The feed source, basically, you're wasting that food. You're taking something that the cow would have used to turn into milk or turn into meat or turn into just continue to grow. And then it's releasing that as methane, and that's not good for anybody. So when you're using something like agalin, what you'll see is about an 8 to 10% reduction in emissions from that enteric methane, a zero impact to efficiency of the cow producing, how much milk they're producing. And in fact, what we see is an efficiency gain. They're using less feed. The cows are eating less feed. So in fact, I was at a couple farms a week ago. We're doing some video out there and talking to them about what happened when they started using agalin. And one of the farmers, she's great. She's the mom of kids who are in my kids' classes. We see each other on field trips and stuff like that. And I asked her the first time I came to the farm after they'd implemented it, she said, we noticed the smell right away. We saw the cows started eating less. They're eating about 5% less, 7% less right away. And we were concerned, maybe they don't like the smell. Is there an issue here? And what they were expecting to see is the milk production tail off. They were expecting to see a drop. And they see no change in milk production. That 5 to 7% less that the cows are eating is because basically it's not getting lost in the emissions. It's not getting lost when that methanogen turns the good food source into an emission. And so they're getting the benefit of less food that they have to buy now as a result. They're getting the benefit of the carbon reduction, and it's something that's really easy for them to implement. And so that program for us is scaling really quickly. We have a ton of farmers that are coming on board to do that as quickly as we can stand them up.
That's so interesting. Are you working with any like universities or like researchers to
Yes, absolutely.
measure all this stuff? Because it seems, I know there's a lot happening in this space right now, and everyone's trying to figure out like what actually works, right? Like what is actually having a meaningful impact, because there's always a lot of hype around certain things, and you kind of need that, peer-reviewed research to sort that out, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody needs to just listen to a farm kid from Alabama and just assume it's right. Though there's some really smart ones there that you should listen to. So our chief scientific advisor is sort of the preeminent expert on dairy life cycle analysis and like what's the carbon footprint there. So we work with a whole variety of universities, work with about 10 different universities. We work with researchers at those places. And for us, it's really important that we're bringing all the tools to the table. One of the things we talk about a lot is there's nothing that we're doing that other folks can't adopt. We're not doing anything that's so proprietary that other dairymen can't adopt those same practices. And so for us, if we can make it easy for the farmer, the same way we want to make it easy for consumers, right? When you walk into the grocery store, we want you to be able to grab that yellow carton and go like, I know that this simple choice, 6 inches to the right, 6 inches to the left, grab the other carton, I can make that happen. We want to make it easier for farmers too. They're running a business. That's their livelihood that they're out there doing. And the last thing that they want to do is make it more complicated or harder. But if you can bring them solutions, especially if it's something that's already going to work for them in other ways, you can really create a winning scenario. That same farmer that I was talking about, where they saw that feed reduction, it's going to be nervous, making me nervous. Like, what's happening here? Travis was talking about the fact that his nutritionist had come to him about a year prior and said, you should really check this out. This Agilent, it can be really great for feed. And he initially balked at the cost, like, oh, what's it going to cost me? That's going to be too hard for me to take on another thing. And so if we can come in and bring the resources that it takes, not just for the funding of that material, but also the documentation, all the other pieces that come along with it, we make it easy for Travis to do what he does best, which is to farm, which is to raise incredible animals, to take care of the earth that he stewards there for his family and for all the folks that are nourished off the food that comes off of it. So we try to make it easy for them so that we can make this scale up. I mean, telling farmers this is going to be harder, not the greatest selling opportunity. Right. We can come and say, we can make this easy for you. And then folks go, okay, great. I wanted to do some of those things anyway. How can I help?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reporting on like cover crops and different like management changes on farms. And it can kind of sound simple, like, oh, it'll just cost a little bit more money, but it kind of changes how you manage your whole operation in some ways. Some of these seemingly small tweaks require like a lot of mental energy too, which I think sometimes in policy world and like foodie world, we don't think about as much. We're getting some interesting questions. I want to encourage you all to submit them. We have some time to take some. This is a good question we got from an attendee. They said, I read a recent piece about alfalfa making up a massive part of California's water footprint because it's mainly grown for cattle consumption. Is Neutral investing in a more sustainable alternative to this? Do you consider water footprints in addition to carbon? It's a good question. I imagine, Jim, you've thought about this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely consider it. The most important thing for us is making sure that we're fulfilling our promise to consumers. Our number one promise is right in the name, is that we're carbon neutral. So we have to nail that. There's no wiggle room. There's no like almost neutral. We kind of got close neutral. It's neutral. So that's what we have to keep our number one focus on. So that's our primary area. But absolutely, the water is really important. There are farmers that we work with that have to curtail their operations or change their operations because they don't have enough access to water. And sometimes that's from growing growing city populations that are starting to draw some of that water out. Sometimes it's from overuse of water from practices that aren't great. But a lot of the things we do have multiple benefits. It's not just that it has a carbon benefit, it can do these other things too. And so, for example, we primarily are working with farmers that are rotationally grazing their cattle. And this is really important. If you're using good rotational grazing management practices, you're going to have better soil health. You're going to have better ability for water to infiltrate. You're going to have less runoff issues. There's all of these pieces that kind of coexist. It's the same with biodiversity. We talk about that a lot. Like everyone in our team, especially, you'll see some of the videos that we create when people talk about why they do this. It's the place that we live. It's the animals. It's the things we're trying to take care of. It's the critters that are out there. So biodiversity is a big deal for us, but biodiversity isn't the name on the carton. And so we want to make sure that we're doing things that have that co-benefit as well. But overarching, we have to make sure it's carbon neutral first. And all those other pieces are generally aligned with good management practices. It'll help in a lot of those other ways.
Okay, interesting. Good question. We have a question from Mohammed too, coming from Randy Rosso. Says, Mohammed, your news model is fascinating. When you do investigative journalism to see if something good is legit, if you find that it is not legit, do you still report on it, or do you move on to something else positive?
That's a really good question. The way I would look at Goodable if I was from the outside is that you have news platforms that cover business, that cover health, that cover sports. Nobody goes to ESPN and says, "Why didn't you cover the presidential debate?" I think that's sort of like the easiest way for us to approach this, which is, look, I know this because I was the one on television telling people about corruption for years. I was the one on CNN that reported all these live shots from around the world whenever bad things happened. I will never disparage that. I think we do need that in our lives. The way that I would describe the landscape now is like, journalism is supposed to hold a mirror up to each of us individually and show us who we are, the good and the bad. So when you look at bad things happening in corruption, you should really be looking at this and say, wow, this is what we are capable of. This is what our elected officials are capable of, what we as human beings are capable of. The problem is that mirror is now like, if you ever went to like a fun house when you were growing up, where like it makes you look really small or really big, it's like all distorted. And I think what we get right now from general news is that it's not an accurate portrayal of who we are, because it's just so negative. And so our mission is basically, let's focus on the positive. There's a whole bunch of other places that show the negative stuff, which is great. Like, I think we need a little bit of that feed in our lives. But for us, we would just pass on that. So for example, if we would do our checks and balances, and then we would see there's a ton of corruption here, I would pass it off to my friends at CNN and say, hey, I was digging into this, and here's what I found. We wouldn't partner with a company that we felt didn't uphold our values and was actually making the world worse. But in terms of us exposing that, no, there are a lot of other people out there that quite frankly can expose it much better than we can.
Interesting. Okay, thanks for that. We have a lot of really great questions, so keep submitting these. The next one comes from Kimmy Cushman. The question is, has Neutral considered also selling plant-based milks? It is a growing market, but research shows that only 1/3 of consumers who drink plant milk do it for environmental reasons. There's huge potential for more people to move toward plant milk. You could sell carbon negative plant milk, is what this question is saying. Have you thought about this in addition to your dairy products? And right now, is it just milk? Or are you also doing like yogurts and other things? Right now, is it just fluid milk?
Fluid milk, we do half and half as well in select markets. And then in our food service business, we have fluid milk, but we're also doing beef. And so this is kind of I think the right place to tie that in, because maybe similar to the way Mohammed was talking about this, where is our area of expertise? Where can we really have an impact? Plant-based, we've talked about it a ton. We've absolutely considered it. From our perspective, though, we want to participate where we can have the biggest impact in total. And when you think about where emissions come from in the food sector, the vast majority of it comes from animal agriculture, from the feed source that goes in from the enteric methane production. And so if you can have an impact on the biggest sources, that's where you're going to have the biggest outcome. That's where you're going to have the biggest total impact on reduction. So for us, we want to look at what has the biggest total footprint and then what has the highest intensity, and that's dairy and beef. And so that's where we decide to make impact. If there's someone who is doing oat milk or, hemp milk or all those other things, those are great. We fully support that. We think lots of people can do that. But the reality is 93% of households in the US still have dairy milk in the fridge. And so if we can make an impact on that gigantic source of emissions, and it's something that's ubiquitous, it's in almost everyone's refrigerator, that's where we feel like we can magnify. And so we fully support the folks who are doing those other items. Plant-based milks, great. Absolutely. There's a lot of different reasons that people can choose those, but we wanted to make sure that we're playing where we can have the biggest impact. And so for us, that's dairy and beef.
Just one note on that. One of the things I find most surprising, I think folks who are consumers find the most surprising, is that plant-based milks, the demand has absolutely gone up. and they've, in many ways replaced some of the fluid milk consumption. Fluid milk consumption has gone down, but overall per capita dairy consumption in the US is at record levels right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because and I mean record like ever, historical records. And I find that a lot of people don't know this because, their household might have oat milk, and then they have yogurt, and then they have cheese, and then they have butter, and then they have ice cream or whatever. And so the product mix has just changed. And so it is absolutely true what this questioner says, that plant-based milks have been growing. But I find that sometimes people aren't aware that overall dairy consumption hasn't gone down in the US. It's gone progressively up. So just one quick little factoid there. And then Corey, I want to flip this to you just for a quick minute, because I know that Shake Shack has, I think you have a mushroom burger and a veggie burger. You have some chicken burger options. Like, do you also think about emissions in terms of nudging people towards different options that have a lower overall environmental footprint compared to beef? Like, do you think about it in terms of swaps between menu items as well, even as you look at individual ingredients?
So I think ultimately Shake Shack is, we serve American classics like burgers and milkshakes, and we're never going to stop serving those items. But we are continuing to look at how we can source more sustainable ingredients for those menu items, from regeneratively raised protein to, the carbon neutral milk for our milkshakes. I just don't think that from like an industry perspective, and I saw that this was one of the questions somebody threw out about like, what would I have to say to the alternative meat section? And one of my favorite questions to answer is, I don't believe we need to abandon meat and dairy. We just need to find a way to fix the system in which they're produced. So I've said it before and I'm going to say it again, but it's not the cow, it's the how. I think cows are vilified, but they can play a huge role in actually helping create healthier ecosystems, from, restoring soils and helping enhance natural biodiversity and capturing carbon. So I think that, they're vilified and people are like, oh, stop eating meat. But I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. For those who do want to minimize the amount of meat that they're eating, we do offer amazing alternatives. So you said we have a veggie burger. It's new and it's delicious, packed with real veggies. And then of course we have our famous shroom burger. So we'll have options that aren't red meat, but I do think that, we sell burgers and we're never not going to stop. It's just finding alternative, ways that this meat is produced. Because if everything, shifts to regenerative agriculture, then it's worth investing in. Like, that is the meat of the future. Like, when Jim kind of talked about it, but really it helps the ecosystem rather than harm it. So really it's just focusing in on how we're getting the meat that we're supplying. And I think that's something that we do really well.
Let me just add on quickly onto that. Let me just jump in very quickly, Jim. I'll take 30 seconds and then pass it over. I think,
go for it. We got time.
I think part of this is creating a dichotomies where they don't need to exist. And this is really important because we live in a world where the media loves putting one side against another. You cannot talk American politics without realizing that one side is against another. Like, it just doesn't happen. And unfortunately, that sort of thinking kind of spreads into different places. And so this is going to be a really big picture statement for me. But if you look at everything that's wrong with the world, it's because people are saying, oh, well, you're not doing enough, or you're not doing enough. Well, instead of saying one side is not doing enough, why don't we look at what they are doing and say, well, they're doing something, right? And I think that's like a baseline way for the entire world to get along, and for people to get along, and everything to get along is like, well, you're doing something. It's the people that are doing nothing that are the problem, right? Or it's the people that are just like doing the same things they've done over and over again for years, and like destroying the planet in the process. Like, that's the problem. The problem shouldn't be like, well, you're doing this, but you need to transition away from meat altogether, or you're doing this, but you need to transition from dairy away altogether. I think the fact that when people do something good, like that in itself is something that should be acknowledged and celebrated, which is the key component here, right? And then all these other bigger picture questions about like, should the entire world be like plant-based proteins and stuff? Like, I can't answer that, but I do think that it's important to acknowledge when people do something good.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear that point. I think part of where that argument comes from, shifting towards plant-based comes down to some of the math around emissions. And that's not untrue. That, I mean, there's a smaller carbon footprint for many plant-based options. Like that is true. I think the reality though is that Americans are not moving away from meat and dairy. And so then it's kind of like, what do you do from there? We have and really great points, everyone. Like, I think it's really good to get into that. We have a really good question from Sergey Kamarandikov, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Neutral set, or the question is for neutral, you're at 60% reduction now with practice changes in terms of emissions. How much more difficult is it to build on that number? Do you see a point to 100%? Do you see a pathway to 100% neutrality just from on-farm activities? And then I'm going to add to this, or essentially, do you think there's always going to be some part of that that's going to need to be offsets that you're buying, carbon offsets? Good question, Sergey.
Yeah, I think it's
sorry
yes,
if I butchered
yes
your
to
name.
both. Yeah, it's yes to both. Is there a path to 100%? Absolutely. Is it challenging? For sure. If it was so simple, other folks would be doing it. It's hard, but it's who we are, and that's absolutely where we're going. One of the biggest challenges for us is how quickly can we stand up new processes to get these things on farm quickly. When we first started, every single farm project was a bespoke, customized analysis of that individual farm. And there are some kinds of interventions that we would do that absolutely still need that level of detail. But for things like our feed additive program, like we were talking about with Agilent, we now have an ability to very, very quickly stand that up and say, okay, based on a few simple questions about the size of the farm and the management practice, we can very quickly come up with an estimate of like what the impact is going to be and how much do we pay those farmers on the front end before the check comes due. Just say, we're going to help put this in place with your farm. We're supporting you on the front end, not saying like check back with us in 5 years and we'll tell you how much we decided to pay you for it. It's like, we'll pay for it on the front end. And so our processes to make that really efficient are super critical, because it helps us go faster. And so now when we can go into a region and start standing up farms quicker in terms of these kind of projects, it makes it much, much easier to accelerate. And so do we have eyes on 100%? Absolutely. Absolutely. At the same time, are offsets still going to be playing a role here? I think so. I mean, for us, anytime we're into a new product portfolio, for example, if we're launching something new that we've not done before, those offsets will be an important bridge to help us get from starting to fully accelerated and moving. So when we sold our first carton of milk, it was all done with offsets. We couldn't put the farm projects in place before we had the product to pay for it. And so that transition to go just in a couple of years from 100% offset base to over 60% happening from the projects we're doing, that's really, really fast for us, but absolutely we can get to 100. But will offsets play a role? Absolutely. Because I think if you do it right, they can be a really valuable resource. And there's research out that will say even people that are using offsets, even if that's not a perfect solution, those folks are also doing more in other areas to do their own reduction as well. And so we think offsets, if they're used correctly, can be a really important tool. But the heart and soul of what we do is always going to be about the reduction we do at the farm. That is the thing that will make us different forever. It's really critical that we can bring those kind of resources to help farmers do what they do best. They're these original stewards of the land. When you give them the knowledge, the resource, the funds, they can do amazing things. So those farmers are the hero. I mean, how would you call that out? But that's the heart and soul of what we do. So will offsets play a role? Absolutely. But the heart and soul is always going to be about what we do with the farmers.
Well, you just mentioned being like unique, or that being a differentiator. And you have to wonder though, if the dairy industry is going to get to being carbon neutral or overall emissions neutral in 2050, a lot more dairy producers are going to have to adopt some of the things you're talking about. So that will be interesting to watch in terms of scale. And like, I don't know, in terms of, percentage of adoption across industry, like that's just not something I'm familiar with, but I would be really curious about that. We have so many good questions coming in. Here's another one from Manj Kumar. I'm so sorry. I cannot pronounce your name, but only the upper income classes can purchase good, healthy food options. How do you plan to make it available to the poor and even expand globally to other developing countries? Really, really good question. I don't know who wants to jump into that. I do think cost is a real consideration here.
Yeah. And I think that this is where, we should really be thinking about policy. Like food policy can play a critical role in creating a sustainable food system, because it has the potential to shape the way that food is produced, the way it's distributed, and then the way it's consumed on a large scale. And I think this is a really timely question as we approach the Farm Bill deadline on September 30th. If properly executed, this bill, the
They're really
deadline,
behind. Yeah.
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 But if properly executed, I think this bill can really help move our food system so that it is more sustainable and equitable. But I do think that that's going to have to policy should play a pivotal role in helping so that people in lower income like countries and developing nations can access the healthy food that you're talking about. And that is really a big problem that we're facing today. I find that it's kind of like, a triangle here, but most amount of people are facing hunger, the most amount of diet related disease, and at the same time the most amount of food waste. And what could really play at the center of that is really strong policy.
Yeah. And maybe that is a good, we only have a couple more minutes. We thought we were going to end a little bit early, but I don't know. We have good questions coming in, but climate smart commodities is something that USDA is working on. So for those of you who aren't familiar, essentially USDA is running a really big project that's a series of pilots that essentially tests out different practice changes with different commodity groups, food companies, agricultural companies, are running a bunch of experiments and measuring outcomes. I think there's a lot of support for this idea because there is not a political path to like regulating emissions on farms in the US. Like there just is not at this time. Like it's just not a political feasibility. And so because of that, you're looking at voluntary things. And the idea is that eventually farmers would get a premium for climate smart commodities, right? Like they do for organic or something. But this has also gotten a ton of criticism because it is partnering with major corporations. It's partnering with, big commodity groups. And I don't know if maybe Jim, you want to share a little bit about like how you think USDA maybe is and isn't doing a good job of like encouraging some of the practices you're talking about, because it has become a little bit controversial in this town, even if it is moving forward.
Yeah.
And you guys aren't doing a climate smart commodity. You're kind of doing your own, you are doing climate smart work, but you are not part of that pilot, correct?
That's correct. So the USDA, the original climate smart commodities grant that went through, they awarded about $2 billion of resources. The vast majority of those went to some of the biggest food companies that are out there. I mean, and candidly, I can understand the argument. The argument is you already have a big footprint, you already have a big resource base. You might be able to implement these things faster if you're dedicating resources that way. So that's where most of the money went. So cross my fingers. Like let's hope they all do a really great job with that, because they should. I mean, the money is there. So there's the fact that there was $2 billion allocated to that was a great win. And then if you look at what happened with the IRA, there's another about $20 billion, and a lot of that's going to look at food practice. So I think there's policy reasons or policy approaches that can really help things immensely. And the fact that there is more dollars toward this than ever we've had in the past is a good thing. But I also really think the answer is going to be consumers. It's going to be about what consumers demand and how companies react to that. Because if you think about the consumer situation today, 86% of all the adults in the US feel that the planet's worth saving, but 51% of those folks, they know it's important, but they don't know what they can do to make a difference. So they know that there's something there. And in many cases, they're willing to pay more. I mean, we of course have to pay attention to accessibility and make sure that it's not so premium that, only 0.5% of the people can get there. We won't scale. We won't be able to actually have the impact we want if we make it so exclusive that nobody can afford it. But if people want to make that change and they don't know how, if you can make it as simple, like I said, just grab that yellow carton instead of the red one, make that easy, because consumers will drive it. To your point, the policy piece, I mean, I want to be optimistic, but I don't have a whole lot of data points that tell me I should be optimistic about thinking our policy is going to get fixed fast enough. But when consumers are telling
Washington, I'll just say it. Washington is a mess. Yeah, the functional level here is not great. My words, not yours, but I can say that because I live here and I cover this stuff. It's very slow moving, and it's going to be a long time before we know if any of this is working. And I think a lot of people would say we don't have time to burn. So I think a lot of people are in that same boat of like, I hope that it works, right? I hope that this is real. I want to end on the note of the consumer. So I want each of you to just briefly kind of say where you think consumers and readers are right now. Maybe start with you, Mohammed. Like what climate stories resonate right now? I see people as being concerned and confused about what they should be doing or can be doing. What are each of you hearing from your consumers, your customers? And we're gonna end on that note of like what do people want to see right now, or what is the vibe? Maybe we'll start with you, Cor, or we're gonna start with you, Mohammed, first.
Yeah. So number
Story, what
one,
climate stories resonate right now?
so number one, I'll speak specifically about Gen Z. Gen Z gets a bad rap in a lot of ways. They're probably
Do
the
they?
first generation in the world that's going to have a lower standard of living than the generation preceding them. So they're really at the cusp of like a big generational shift. But they care deeply about the environment, and they care deeply about solving some of the world's problems that, quite frankly, the older generations created for them, which really isn't fair. But that's the reality. I think the principle here, and I've seen this at play whether I'm in war zones, whether I'm in boardrooms, it's the same principle that if everything is equal, people will always choose an option that makes them healthier, happier, saves them more money. They will choose the better of two options. The challenge is, let's talk about dairy. The challenge is, part of it is creating that supply chain that creates a product that's better for the environment. The second part is, which is what Corey deals with in her side of this, which is how do you integrate that offering in a way that actually doesn't pass the cost onto the consumer, right? Can you make a change by taking this tool, applying it here, and everybody wins? If you offer a milkshake that's fully sustainable, carbon neutral, and tastes amazing, in fact, tastes even better than milk that was not produced in that way, and you make the price the same, 99% of the people will choose the one that makes the world better. The real challenge here is how do you do that in a way where it's an even choice? And if you can create that even choice, which is like this is the whole thing about like making the world better and sustainability. How do you create that into an equal choice where they don't have to spend more money, they don't have to drive further, it's the same convenience, same taste level, same everything. So for example, if Corey said, hey, we've implemented neutral milk, but you have to drive an extra 10 minutes to go there, people just won't do it. But if you can make it available at the same place they always go to, the same grocer, the same freezer, the same price, all those things, they will always choose the better of the two options. And I think that's the real challenge. And it's the flip side of what you're saying, Helena, about the policy stuff. Like, I think you have to expect that policy is going to be dysfunctional. I think nobody thinks about like what happens in Congress or the Senate, and they're like, oh, those guys are doing their jobs. Nobody ever thinks that way. And so
other countries are figuring out how to do climate policy, but not here. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking as the Canadian here in the room, like, yeah, we look at what's happening in America and we're like, how does anything ever get done? But I think that's okay and that's understandable if the neutrals of the world and the Shake Shacks of the world can actually figure out a way to just bypass this and say, well, great, we've got a product here, we've got a solution here. It's going to be an evil playing field. We don't have to, charge people more money, ask them to sacrifice more. Let's do it. That, I think, is the answer to sustainability. And those solutions, whether it's neutral or others, are starting to be created now, which is really exciting because the baseline is that people will choose what makes the planet better.
Yeah, it's hard though, because I think when you see all the ways that federal policy could be scaling change, I think I hear your point though. Really quick, Corey and Jim, what are you hearing from consumers on like, do you find that Shake Shack customers are they concerned about climate and environmental footprint? Do they are they asking you to make changes or a little bit more proactive?
Yeah, I definitely think that, a certain sect of consumers is asking for it. On our end, we're being a bit more proactive about it though, just because we know it's the right thing to do. I think that there needs to be a bit more education. And we kind of talked about this earlier with the greenwashing, green hushing piece, but, for consumers that care about the environment, they will make the choice to purchase neutral milk. But for those who don't know what that means, they might not purchase it because they simply don't know what it means. So I think education is a huge piece that we're going to continue to work on. How can we really tell the story about the product so that consumers understand? And then with that, I think consumers have a really important role to play in choosing, these sustainable alternatives and really supporting the companies that are choosing to take responsibility for their impact, because it helps these organizations justify these supply chain changes. Particularly if it does cost more for them. So for instance, if we do have like a big marketing push around, our milkshake using neutral. And then we see an uptick in the number of people purchasing milkshakes. That's really great news for us and helps justify all of the work that went in the back end to make those supply chain switches. And I think consumers often are like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's like one milkshake, but one milkshake plus one milkshake, and it's like a whole domino effect. And then you can reach economies of scale. And now other, quick service restaurants are using neutral. And I think that the consumers play a really important role and should definitely not take their decisions lightly.
It'll be interesting to see whether or not that does pick up in like the quick service space. Because right now where I'm seeing it is consumer packaged goods at like higher end grocers or natural food sections or whatever.
Totally.
But that probably means it's coming for restaurants. So it's something to watch. Okay, Jim, I'm gonna let you have the last word because we're at time. What are you hearing from consumers on like just in terms of demand and what questions they have?
They're ready. 6 out of 7 folks in the US understand that climate change is real and that humans are having an impact. That is a fact that 6 out of every 7 people in this country now acknowledge. 73% of people in the US feel like fighting climate change is important to them. And the ones who do, 62% of them agree that food choices can make an impact. So we look at this data very hard because that's where we have a feeling, we have a gut, we have a trust about what matters, but we also want to make sure that we're smart enough to look at the data. So the data is very compelling that will say consumers are ready if you can get them there. So the way that we kind of think about the market, there's about 16% of people that we think today, not only do they get it and they care, they're already willing to make changes. They're already making food choices that are different. There's that next group. So those are kind of the early adopters. That next 30%.
So it's like a climate consumer, food consumer. Okay.
Absolutely. That next 30% of folks say, this is important to me, but they don't know if the choice, like grabbing the yellow carton, is that really making enough of a difference? That next 30%, that's where the education comes in. So when they can see transparently with a lot of trust that, yeah, absolutely, I can trust this thing. When I pick that yellow carton up, I know that it means it's 100% carbon neutral. It's been checked out by people who are scientists who are looking at this. So I don't have to think about it myself, but it's trust. And that's where you get that early adopter phase to switch into the early majority. And then you can really, really increase your scale. And so the consumers are ready for it. And what we see in our own work is that we're still new. We think we're doing a lot of cool stuff, but we're still very small. We're available in about 2,000 stores, but most people in the US still don't know we exist. Where we're running advertising, where people start to see that we exist, we immediately see an uptick in our volume. We see lift right away when people are like, oh, that's a thing that exists. Great. Let me go grab that yellow carton. So we see the impact happening right away. When people know there's an option, they'll make a good choice. And we want to be their supporter.
It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out too. I do think that 30% of consumers who's like, is this real? That's going to be a real challenge to, I think, overcome and
convince them.
It's going to be a time. It's going to like, and I am a food reporter and I have trouble differentiating claims and navigating it. So it does feel like we're kind of going to be in a lawlessness before maybe we kind of, when things settle into sort of order and all of that. So, but on that note, you all have been wonderful. I know we went just a couple of minutes over, but I think the conversation was well worth it. Thank you to Neutral and Shake Shack and Goodable. I love your Kermit the Frog in the back. That's a real highlight in there. I appreciate your time. Thanks to you all for joining. I hope you have a great rest of Climate Week. And if you're into food policy, definitely check out my newsletter, Food Fix. It's a great resource. And I will talk to all of you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.